Hello. Welcome, everybody, to the College of Foreign Language and Literature at Kyunghee University. My name's Jason Barker, and this is our Symposium, Manifestos for an International University. I'll just have some sound on my computer here. Sorry about that. Please, if you are joining us on YouTube, please be aware that there is a Korean translation of today's manifesto available. It's in the chat box. You can follow the link, and you should find it if you need it. Do please, if you're not aware of us, and this is the first time, this is your first time joining us on YouTube, please check our schedule. We are located, if you like, online. This is not a university.com where you can find more information about us and about our symposium. But for the moment, all I can say really is thank you, and I hope you enjoy today's intervention. Without further ado, let me introduce to you today's guest. Nina Power is a philosopher, cultural critic, and social theorist. She received her PhD from Middlesex University and has spent many years teaching philosophy, culture and media theory in higher and further education in the UK. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a member of the British Philosophical Association. She is the translator with Alberto Toscano of Alan Badiou's On Beckett, and author of One-Dimensional Woman, of which there is a Korean translation available, published in 2018. Her new book, What Do Men Want?, is due to be published by Penguin in August, and she is currently teaching at the Mary Ward Centre in London. So it's a great pleasure to have her here today. I'm glad that she's agreed to join us. Nina, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Just to check, is the sound okay?
We're hearing you well, I think, right?
Okay, great. I'll carry on until there's any issue, which I hope there won't be. So thank you, Jason, for the invitation. And the series is amazing, you know, in terms of the people you've got and the organisation. And I've been listening to Justin, Clemens and AJ Bartlett's contributions so far, which are extremely interesting and very both scholarly and rigorous and, you know, profound even. And the website is by Keith Tilford is fantastic as well. So I'm very pleased to be part of this series. And I think it's an interestingly provocative and contentious topic. So I've written something quite short, which I wouldn't necessarily describe as a manifesto exactly, more like a kind of intervention, written in a sort of slightly anti-university style, perhaps. So my contribution today is called "The University is Dead, Long Live Thought." So I want to begin by talking about my overall approach to thought and my thoughts regarding the university, which I am convinced, as are many others, I'm sure, that for multiple reasons cannot and will not survive in its current incarnation. I have been personally studying and teaching philosophy for 23 years, and I was a lecturer at university for 13 of those years, a job which I left over a year ago, the better to think. It is at this moment a cliche to say that the modern university in the West is overly bureaucratic, consumerist, dominated by ideology of one kind or another, that the staff are increasingly proletarianized, and so on. But the problem is, of course, deeper. The university has lost its purpose, which I think in Justin's paper in particular, he made clear has shifted and changed depending on the different regime, we could say. As Bill Reddings, author of this great book called The University in Ruins, he was writing in the mid-1990s, quite a long time ago, he asked this question: can the university, once stripped of its cultural mission, be something other than a bureaucratic arm of the unipolar capitalist system? The university today is still, however, I would argue, engaged in a cultural mission, though one very different from, let's say, the nationalist project envisaged by Humboldt at the end of the 18th century and others that Redding discusses, in which the function of the university was to cultivate national subjects, let's say. Global transnationalism has today, as its ideological concomitant, a set of North American, overwhelmingly, political commitments purporting to be universal. What we can see as perhaps the United States' last-ditch attempt to preserve its imperialist hegemony at the level of discourse or culture. As Catherine Liu puts it in her recent polemic Virtue Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class, quote, people, and Liu defines the PMC, the professional managerial class, to include academics, of course. So she says, people trained in the regime of symbolic manipulation love to weaponize outrage to fuel moral panics, but they are unable and unwilling to face their identity as a class. In the liberal professions, they police each other to enforce the sort of social and intellectual conformity required by their class, one that is fundamentally fragmented by competition and individualism. All PMC-approved policies about inequality, racism, and bias circle back to strengthening their sense of political agency and cultural and moral superiority. Today's university is a circular, bureaucratic entity that overproduces and overpromises graduates a role in the world. A material lack whose holes are filled by participation in a particularly divisive moral discourse that radically and increasingly opposes any sense of genuine dissensus, disagreement, or agonism. No debate is a common response online and increasingly offline to a variety of positions and arguments. And no platforming, a tactic used in the past to stop fascist speakers from speaking at universities or in public places, has been expanded to include feminists, religious speakers, and pretty much anyone accused of holding the wrong position, regardless of whether they are in the moment talking about controversial, in inverted commas, subjects in any particular talk that they've been invited to or otherwise. So I think the vast majority of people, and as AJ Bartlett pointed out in his talk, the university has largely historically been irrelevant to the vast majority of people. And this has no bearing, in fact, on what we would call thought, genuine thinking. I'm interested in this thought outside of the university, or what we might call the post-university, as an existential project. It is manifestly clear that thought, intelligence, curiosity, and the will to learn is in no way restricted to the institution, attending which, in any case, results in the lifetime accumulation of extreme financial debt in many countries these days. Indeed, it is increasingly obvious that many real discussions, that is to say, discussions that touch on questions of value, reality, and politics in the sense of how we might collectively live better or in the best possible way that we can together, are had in a superior way outside of the academy, and indeed they're happening all the time already. But I want to defend, if you like, a particular angle on this, which is to do with philosophy and the role that philosophy in particular might play. I'm immersed in this subject, a subject which I think belongs to everyone, regardless of whether they have studied it or not. Philosophy is in many ways the most empty and most open of disciplines, in that it has no specific domain other than that of thought itself, and everybody thinks, as Spinoza says. We don't need Spinoza to know this, however. Everybody thinks. Philosophy is opposed to certainty and to money, and therefore opposed to the university in its current incarnation. It is indifferent to public opinion, doxa, but it is not necessarily pessimistic or nihilistic, although it can be, often because it wants to pursue a thought until the bitter end, and sometimes the conclusions it reaches in this way are bleak or upsetting when juxtaposed, in particular, to the current cultural emphasis on happiness and well-being, for example. But philosophy is a pursuit that gets extremely close to the drive itself. The desire to pursue a thought until it can be adequately described, communicated, critically compared and understood is itself on the side of life, of striving. To keep thinking is to remain and to stay alive. It is not to capitulate, even when people would rather you did not continue thinking. And this is why courage is so important for Socrates, for example. This is why courage is integral to being or becoming a philosopher in the broadest sense. In all these senses, then, philosophy is today opposed to the prevailing culture, much of which comes from the university, which increasingly demands the right position in lightning fast time. Western culture, with its obsession with speed and action, compels its subjects to adopt views that then become identities. And all too often, the link between reality and idea is broken in favour of the latter. Thoughts become detached from the world and mass delusions begin to dominate. Human beings at the anthropological level are always extremely vulnerable to cult-like thinking and fads and fashion. To give you one example, materialism. Historical materialism as approach to thinking about history. History is the history of class struggle, of material production, of the relationship between production and consumption, in terms of thinking of labour and energy. This approach seems to have disappeared somehow in the last few years from parts of the left in favour of new kinds of idealism regarding identity in particular, which is all too compatible with consumer capitalism. You are what you buy, buying makes you who you are. We are always confronted with the problem of institutions in relation to ideology, and the university as a particular kind of institution, although one that is sort of increasingly indiscernible from many others. As Louis Althusser puts it in Philosophy and Marxism, his interviews with Fernanda Navarro from 1984 to 87, man is an ideological animal. Ideology, he states, has always existed and always will exist. Its content might change, but its function never will. Ideology is not a set of ideas about the world, but, quote, a clear representation of the world of ideas as a social product. Althusser states that ideologies are inseparable from the institutions, quote, by means of which they are manifested with their codes, languages, customs, rites, and ceremonies. Furthermore, he argues no ideology is purely arbitrary. It is always an index of real problems, albeit cloaked in a form of misrecognition and so necessarily illusory. So, philosophy, in the sense that I mean it, beyond the academy, and thinking, almost anti-institutional thinking, we could say, has a role here. What are the real problems today that ideology is indexing? We can ask in the first place, who benefits, materially and otherwise, from representing the world in such and such a way? In this sense, the post-university represented by philosophy, as its method, if you like, has as its mission, in part, the analysis of ideology. It must, by necessity in this regard, be anti-capitalist, as ideology is always involved in the perpetuation of social reproduction, and our system is currently capitalist. Philosophy is also opposed to the utilitarian spirit of capitalism because it is useless and generates no profit. Philosophy or thought is something everyone can do, something that belongs to everyone. It requires no official training, no money, only a little time and space, precisely what is absent and everywhere destroyed today. A conversation with a friend for no reason is a form of resistance. To think for oneself is surprisingly difficult and may win you no friends. But then again, how many friends do we need? The great philosopher who lived in a barrel, or perhaps it was a water cistern, In ancient Greece, Diogenes, my personal hero, would say that to manage our lives properly, we need either reason or a rope. But I would suggest that today the rope is no kind of exit, because the age of poets is over, and death today, while everywhere, is also distant from us, made hygienic, as we can see in the past year of the pandemic. And I'm particularly drawn to the work of Giorgio Agamben and Illich, to resurrect Ivan Illich, in terms of his thinking about the role of health in the political organization of today. Besides, we are already too tangled in cables everywhere, in networks and webs. Everyday strangulation is threatened constantly. Why then choose the noose when the noose has already chosen us? This is also a reworking of Camus as well. The fundamental question being the question of suicide, and once you've answered negatively because you realize that suicide is itself an affirmation of the meaning of life, then you have to persist in absurdity with your being in an ongoing manner. So we must live. And culture today needs thought more than ever. It needs humour and humility and ambivalence and ambiguity and time. It needs people brave enough to think against the system and against the ideology of the system, which is less obvious than we might sometimes think. This is what I'm interested in, this good-natured but vital kind of thought and critique, how to insert oneself into the chaos. I think that teaching is largely about enthusiasm and the transmission of passion, before it is about the communication of particular ideas. The latter are only infused with meaning because of the former. To have understood something for yourself, to think freely, is one of the most beautiful experiences we are permitted. To think and to work collectively, even with great, or especially with great divergences of opinion, is truly sublime. I've been writing and teaching since the mid-2000s. I've written about a great number of topics over the past 20 years in a variety of different forms and genres, on blogs, for newspapers, in academic journals, in essays and books, and I've given many talks. I've written and spoken about feminism, capitalism, photography, music, art, protest, care, love, nature, and multiple other things. I've dedicated my life to trying to better understand what is happening, how we can think about it, and what is of value in this world. In the past few years, in the current climate, I've been particularly focused on the possibility and indeed the necessity of dialogue, one of the oldest philosophical imperatives, or one of the oldest philosophical motive forces, we could say, or methodologies. There is, as I am sure people are aware, an increasing climate of censorship, no platforming, I've already mentioned, and the refusal to discuss increasingly large numbers of topics in favour of a simplistic, undemocratic and dogmatic party line. Only today there is no obvious party. This is one of the things we must precisely try to understand. Why is contemporary ideology so acephalic, to borrow the word from Bataille, which is to say headless? There may be priests of this new ideology, but it lacks the cult of personality common to 20th century political movements, both left and right. So in the shift to the 21st century, we see a kind of headless ideology, and it's not clear who the leaders are, if they do exist. There's a kind of a headless network quality to the mantras of the new ideology, which is something we also must come to understand. Before the lockdown, I set up a project called Amity Animosity, in which I met anyone who wrote to me who wanted to have a conversation, wherever they wanted to meet. And here we discuss friendship and anything else that the other person wanted to talk about in private. So I didn't record the conversation, there was no notes, it was simply a conversation with anyone about anything they wanted to talk about in the place that they wanted to meet. And it is indeed these kind of dialogues, we could say, that generate confidence or courage, necessary to resist the onslaught of the stupidity and fear of modern life. Much of my time in the past few years has also been about researching and thinking about men who have increasingly come under a sort of barrage of insults relating to toxic masculinity and mansplaining and manspreading and and somehow men have become the target of a kind of blame for all many contemporary ills. And so I've been thinking about this, we could say demonization of men, whether it is justified historically or otherwise, and how we might move beyond this moment in our own culture. And a lot of my thinking came down in the end to this question of dialogue again. In the end, about what kind of conversations between men and women might be possible, what they might mean, how it's possible to be more playful and to live more beautifully and less resentfully. We are increasingly or often encouraged to feel that the other is responsible for my lack. That, let's say, women can blame men for their unhappiness, or men can blame women, or one group can blame another group for whatever they feel is missing in their life. When really, in the end, we all share a fundamental collective desire to be understood, to understand, to speak, and to be heard, and to listen. I am, if it is not too absurd to say, following in the tradition of Diogenes, who I've already mentioned, who declared himself to be a citizen of the world, and spent his time upsetting the good people of Athens by pointing out their various hypocrisies, interested in where the edges of today lie. And in this sense, Diogenes is kind of like a punk Socrates. I mean, Socrates is pretty punk, but Diogenes takes it further. He doesn't go live in the countryside. He hangs around in the city, upsetting everyone constantly in a very amusing way. And we only know about these apocryphally, of course, just like Socrates never wrote anything down. What we thought we knew 5 years ago, or even 5 minutes ago, may no longer hold. And we are constantly surrounded by competing ideas and stories, all of which are pleading for our attention. To be well placed to understand these narratives, to understand and evaluate them, is to have a baseline confidence in your own thought, which is the first thing that you need before you can deal with anything else. To play with the edges, to locate them even, to analyze them, is to understand the very nature of our culture as a whole, and the ideology, let's say, of our culture, where it bleeds into the gaps and where there are holes within it. I envisage my role, therefore, as a teacher outside of the academy. These days I'm teaching adult education, where people learn purely for their own sake. It's a purely question of will. There's no assessment. There's no advantage to taking any of my courses. They are simply a pure sight of enjoyment. And so this kind of image of Diogenes that's slightly kinder, perhaps, and more enthusiastic, more feminine, we could say. Not this grumpy man in a barrel, but a sort of strange pixie-ish version of Diogenes. Talking to anybody and listening to them too. Not criticizing for the sake of it, but rather helping others to understand what they already know, but could not yet perhaps formulate. This is not because I know more than anyone else, but because I know that I know less, which again is the philosopher's starting point. This lack of certainty is our greatest critical weapon, the most important starting point. Once it is combined also with a kind of paradoxical confidence in the belief that one knows nothing. It requires only a kind of commitment to understand, or a desire to understand, let's say. The contemporary university is an ideological factory, repeating the story the system wants it to tell and to retell. It is not a critical or antagonistic institution. Results and arguments that go against the dominant ideology are suppressed or barred from entry. This is undoubtedly a massive problem for science, which must instead find itself funded by corporations who will always have their own agenda. And it is the liberal arts that have in their own way succeeded as the dominant force in ideology dissemination, even as we simultaneously live in a scientific, or rather techno-scientific, world. So what of the post-university? I want to return to the thought of Ivan Illich, himself a kind of Diogenes-type figure in many ways, author of Deschooling Society, for some insight. In a text called After Deschooling, What? From 1971, Illich describes what he calls the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum, he says, teaches all children that economically valuable knowledge is the result of professional teaching and that social entitlements depend upon the rank achieved in a bureaucratic process. The hidden curriculum transforms the explicit curriculum into a commodity and makes its acquisition the securest form of wealth. And this is very similar to what Catherine Liu is saying in the Virtue Hoarders about the professional managerial class. And deschooling for Illich is really about this process of stepping outside of the school, sort of ridding oneself of the structure of learning that precisely bureaucratizes and commoditizes knowledge in favor of things like skill exchanges and a genuine kind of exchange of ideas and thoughts and arguments outside of this rigid reward hierarchy. Illich, and perhaps we should be too, in terms of, let's say, de-universitizing society rather than deschooling. I'm sort of upping his image of schools to the university here. He is, however, careful not to push for a too rapid deschooling. So here, a too rapid de-universitizing. So in our case, the post-university landscape. Freedom for education is ultimately the positive value for Illich. He says we can disestablish schools or we can de-school culture, and it's the latter that he's more interested in doing. Illich talks instead of the need for skill sharing and skill matching and of access to facts and to tools in an increasingly democratic way. In some ways, of course, this kind of para-academic learning is more possible than ever. And indeed, if I've done this, if you set up a course on a particular thinker, I taught one on Bataille, I'm teaching one on Illich outside of the university, people from all over the world will join the course. There'll be enough people who are interested enough to simply want to read this thinker or to spend 8 weeks discussing the text by this person out completely para-academically, completely post-university. There is a will to learn and to know, and you don't need that many people to run a course like this online. I mean, for all of the downsides of this contemporary technology, it does, of course, permit at least the, let's say the consensual association of like-minded individuals who might otherwise not encounter each other. And there's a kind of almost constitutive heartbreak, I suppose, for the philosopher about the question of proximity, because, of course, the dialogue for Plato, as Derrida and others criticizes, is all about the metaphysics of presence. It's about being there with someone, having the conversation, just like my friendship project was about this. But the opposite of that is the kind of non-proximate network, or the non-proximate para-academic group who have a shared interest. So all you need in a certain sense is will and access to the internet, which of course is still an uneven proposition. So I want to just briefly conclude by suggesting that we need to detach learning and knowledge from the contemporary university altogether. If I had a 17 or 18-year-old child, I would not recommend that they attend the contemporary university. To not imagine that what happens at universities is in any way superior to what happens already outside of them. Our societies need to radically revalue particular kinds of knowledge and to recognize skill and enthusiasm as the two poles of learning rather than status and money. Philosophy operates, therefore, as a kind of wedge to open up the difference between these two very, very distinct drives, we could say, one of which is a genuine drive and the other of which is a kind of frightened, restrictive drive in many ways. In this sense, there needs to be more philosophy everywhere at all times. Where were the philosophers in the pandemic? Agamben was one of the few people who said anything, who defended thought controversially in the pandemic. Most philosophers didn't say anything about what was happening. They didn't speak out against the crackdown on civil liberties. They didn't ask questions about what this meant for our shared and collective humanity. They were silent. They were acquiescent. Those people who had jobs in the institution were absolutely pathetic, as they always are, because they don't want to lose their position. They are fundamentally motivated by remaining in place, which makes them absolutely opposed to the courageous drive which is necessary for genuine thought. So more philosophy everywhere at all times, outside of the institution. Then the hegemonic stranglehold over higher education will be ended, and life will become more beautiful and more interesting for everyone. The end.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thanks very much indeed. Do we have any questions here? Would anyone like to ask a question? There are people here. I couldn't help noticing, I'm always delighted when I see a question pop up. We had a couple of questions pop up as Nina was speaking. 2 questions, actually. So, first of all, are you ready for this one, Nina?
Oh, sure. Is this on the YouTube thing?
Yeah, I don't think it would. It probably. I mean, you can. I usually say to our guests not to access YouTube because it's with the sound and stuff. You can end up with YouTube feedback. But I'll just read it, right? So Sung Jae-oh is asking. Thanks for the good lecture, Nina. Do you agree with Justin Clemens' opinion that university discourse prevents us from thinking, quote unquote, outside of the university?
Yeah, so I got to that bit in Justin's lecture, and obviously this is the Lacan point, and let me see if I can remember. There's a S1 at the bottom left, going to S2, then across to the objet pétillard over the barred subject, right? That's the university discourse.
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's agree.
So, okay, so you have the master signifier and the sort of relation to knowledge, therefore, in that exchange. I mean, to be honest, I don't. Apart from this symbolic depiction, I'm not entirely sure. I know. Is the kind of idea? Is the question that the university discourse itself prevents a discourse of the outside, or a discourse that is in the outside?
Yeah, I think we're talking about the kind of bureaucratization of knowledge, right, which becomes so ubiquitous that the university is no longer the sole and privileged site of that discourse. And I guess, you know, Sung Jae is quote unquote outside. You know, we were discussing this with Justin. The university is such a kind of victim, if you like, of its own success, that to kind of think outside it, you know, to kind of delimit or demarcate a space, a site outside of the university, as you're kind of as you're kind of suggesting and arguing here, you know, in that sense, it kind of raises a problem. I suppose the best example of the university discourse, to take a kind of contemporary example, would be something like the COVID panic right now. I mean, what's happened is the scientists, you have this kind of bureaucratization of knowledge, this pseudo-science, which is kind of taken over and which is kind of informing every kind of political decision or being used as a kind of justification for all sorts of crazy you know, directives and initiatives and laws and restrictions on people, and that but kind of, you know, as people involved in university discourse, we can't kind of get outside that because we have to kind of take it seriously, right, in order to sort of criticize it. You know, it's kind of, we're sort of trapped in that. So that, I suppose, is the obvious example, right? You can't get out of that. Just bureaucratization of knowledge, you can't escape from it because it's no longer, you know, the university is no longer that kind of privileged site of knowledge and knowledge production, right? It's become
no, but it kind of is still the privileged site because it's kind of it sort of but it's both powerless, as in, you can easily ignore it, like, which is why most academic papers are read by like -4 people. Even though the institution is constantly encouraging its staff to write, publish, right, to meet some other demented Stalinist quotas. But I mean, I take Justin's point in his talk where he says, to abandon the idea of abandoning the university itself is part of the university itself, right? The part of university discourse is constantly tied up with this. And so there may be a way in which there is an inescapability of a certain relation to the university discourse, right? Which, which is ultimately castrating, which is ultimately inhibiting, right? So that there's no courage in the university discourse, right? One becomes addicted to the circuit of knowledge, or the desire for knowledge, and it becomes increasingly institutionalized, right? And in this sense, I think Althusser is correct to say that obviously the moment we start talking about ideology and the eternal quality of ideology, there is no outside of ideology, and then the relationship between ideology and the institution, right? Absolutely. But so the what else is left, right? You could say, there are other kinds of knowledge, right? There's the knowledge that one gains in a different way, that isn't valued, that doesn't have any status or value whatsoever within the institution of the university, right? It's not tied to I don't know, ranking, hierarchy, achievement, income, I don't know, class. Okay, but what is this kind of knowledge, right? This is something like, you would have to say, almost like an anti-knowledge. It would be, in the Illichian sense, a kind of de-knowledge, right? Something that actually detracts from the idea of knowledge as captured by the university discourse. So it would have to present itself in the form of silence or withdrawal or absence, or it would have to take on a different form. And in that sense, it would be very difficult to talk about. But I think there is something.
Lacan talks about hysteria, right? And but for him, that's not an answer either, right? Because the students in '68 were being hysterical, and and he said, look, this is not an answer. You just want a new master. So you also have that, which he's isn't kind of isn't a kind of way out either.
But I think the hysterical discourse, I mean, isn't there like a fifth discourse, like, I don't know, the psychotic discourse? I mean, the idea of having like a real relation to the outside would be the position of the psychotic, to be, have a relation to nature, to the outside in that sense. Like, and in a way, this is what has been completely cut off from people in the last year. That actually the outside in the strict real sense, right? And I do think, when Plato makes his cave allegory, it's not an allegory. He means the sun. The sun is not a symbol. I mean, it can also be a symbol, right? But it's not only a symbol. It's literally going outside, and if you think about dialogue in the form of the practice of dialogue, walking around outside with a friend, or with an interlocutor, with somebody whose mind you trust in a way, and also whose discourse you trust, that the discourse within the remit of the dialogue, whether we call the other person a friend or a friend of the good in Aristotle's sense, that we have a shared interest and commitment, if not to the city, because that's impossible now in a way, but to the good, that we trust the other person enough, in a way, not to betray our own mistakes in working out. And I think for a lot of people today, there is no friend, there is no intellectual friend. There is only a kind of a technocratic spy machine in which, if you say the wrong thing, you can, you'll lose your, existing friends, your job, you'll be hounded, whatever. I mean, this kind of, or your data will be mined constantly, and or you won't feel very secure. So there is no, in that sense, there is, and also I think, I noticed this as the years went on, teaching, and obviously if you're teaching philosophy, people need to be able to make mistakes. They need to be able to say things, to explore things, in which they might entertain ideas that, potentially might upset other people. I mean, a lot of moral philosophy is about, terrible thought experiments, if you see what I mean. And philosophy philosophy's drive is to think in a way the worst, not necessarily in a negative way, but to always think the bleakest things, you know, to think, let's say, from the standpoint of the heat death of the universe, to explore questions of I don't know, violence, murder, rage, and all of these sorts of things. And so, but what I could feel happening was an increasing reluctance on the part of students to openly explore difficult ideas, for fear I felt of, you know, being then attacked by other students. So that kind of generosity of dialogue, which is necessary for getting yourself anywhere, even to begin in thought, you know, to enter into aporia, and then to even question your own, you know, assumptions, and then to get, you know, in a way to go backwards in order then to restate your assumptions more clearly, was becoming harder and harder, I think, you know, because people were increasingly worried about these, you know, saying or doing the wrong thing. And you know, one of the problems of living in a sort of post-Christian culture that nevertheless is still Christian in some ways, is that we've lost the kinder, gentler bits of Christianity, which are to do with like forgiveness and atonement. You know, there's just no possibility of that. It's like you've done or said something stupid, that's who you are, you know, and everybody's sort of pinned to the worst thing they've done. And this is a very, very detrimental for any you know, any thought, basically, both within and outside the university.
Yeah, look, let's move on then. Thanks very much for that answer. Yeah, I mean, my experience in Korea is perhaps slightly different, although we do have a kind of Christian, you know, dimension. That's for another time. Ronald Pellman is asking, Diogenes seems like a regressive role model for students in a COVID-19 world. Can you not give us a more hopeful figure?
No, well, I mean, I don't know. I think Diogenes is hilarious. I mean, he, you know, he's extremely funny, like in the anecdotes. And I mean, one of the points about Diogenes, I think, is that he lives on the scraps of the city. You know, I mean, he lives like a dog. That's why he's a cynic, you know, because that's where the word comes from. And so he, rather than setting up a nice commune or going to the garden like Epicurus, you know, he's like, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to sit on the edge of the city and, you know, talk to everyone who comes past and mock them and you know, question what they're doing and look for an honest man and eat whatever people give me. You know, I mean, in a sense, there's very little that distinguishes Diogenes on the face of it from being a homeless person, right? And in a way, what is the difference between Diogenes and a homeless person? In a way, nothing, apart from the apocryphal anecdotes that we have about him. You know, like walking backwards when everyone's walking in the same direction, or you know, his supposed encounter with Alexander. Like, you know, Alexander conquers the world and then, you know, asks Diogenes, well, what do you want? And he says, you know, I want you to get out of the way of the sun. You're my son, Alexander. You know, and this kind of, you know, relation between the micro and the macro, and his idea of being a kind of citizen of the world. And, you know, I don't know, there's something, I suppose, it's partly to do with discourse, maybe not in the fancy Lacanian way, but to do with the edges of discourse, right? I think in the last few years we saw a lot of attacks on the idea of like edgelords and the idea of being edgy, and this became sort of increasingly associated with the right or with Trump supporters, whereas previously kind of subversion on the cultural level was more associated with the left. You know, the left were using subversion and humour in order to criticise the right or conservatism and so on, and that's certainly the image of cultural transgression that I understood in the 80s and 90s, and you know, and this was overwhelmingly a left game to play. And I think it's sort of increasingly important to play this game, in fact, to represent and to understand the limits of what it is possible to say within a discourse, and by doing so to kind of expose, as Althusser would say, the kind of the real truths, the real struggles over reality that are in fact happening, that the index of the problem. So ideology is always there, but it's always about something, you know, and it's that kind of what is actually going on here underneath this, and who benefits from, you know, let's say what is a hysterical reaction sometimes to people asking questions or pushing buttons or being annoying. And philosophers, I think basically fundamentally, and this is why I like Diogenes, it's the job of the philosopher to be annoying. You know, that this is fundamentally what they do. They basically like have a stick, you know, and all you need is a stick. You can draw on the ground, you can draw the symbols and the squares and the circles, and you can teach anything with a stick, right? And it's also a magic wand. And the philosopher is basically there going, you know, this is why Socrates is like a gadfly or a horsefly on the body of the state. This is why Diogenes is sort of like, you know, throwing pebbles at people and being a dick. And in that sense, I do want there to be more Diogenes-like behaviour, and including from students, you know, which isn't hysterical, which isn't conformist, but is genuinely motivated, I suppose, by the spirit of provocation, you know, in order to sort of challenge, you know, the institution's own idiocies, or the idiocies in oneself. And that's the thing. Diogenes also is mocking himself, right? He's not saying, you know, I'm better than all of you, or even if he is, sometimes he's saying it in a way that kind of, you know, utterly provokes other people, right? It's, you know, he's also the victim of Diogenes, of his own humour. And this is another thing that seems to have kind of been abandoned by the wayside, which is this kind of self-mockery, you know, on the way to a kind of self-understanding. You know, and I think to have a seminar in which everyone is sort of gently mocking everyone else, including themselves, is a much more healthy way than sort of policing everyone, or, you know, being too afraid to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? What you probably can't see, of course, on your for those of you on YouTube, and for Nina too, is we actually have a balcony, right, which is like above this, and there are thousands of people up there, right? And there's, you know, and so this is, you know, and I can't ask them, unfortunately, because they're just too far away. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
But no, let me come back on that then, because I mean, this idea of self-mockery is interesting, and but there are kind of two directions in which that cynicism could go, right? I mean, you've already talked about the difficulty that you found with your students and their reluctance to kind of engage in critical thinking in the classroom, and that's something I think everybody is familiar with, right? But nevertheless, there is that kind of cynicism which is about you know, being cynical of the delusions that sustain our goals in life and our career aspirations, right? I mean, so I think we'd all agree, however difficult it is, to kind of to generate that and to encourage that in students, that's probably one good objective for a teacher or you know, an educator. I mean, there's another cynicism though, right? And you're talking about self-mockery, and that seems to be a little bit more problematic. And that, I suppose, is the more anti-philosophical cynicism, right? The kind of anti-thought that you get in late Nietzsche, which is kind of really hysterical, right? And really quite odd, you could say. Well, okay, there's a whole debate about that, right? Which we won't go into. But for the sake of argument, you know, you get into a very weird area, I think, especially today, and just coming back to the experience of the contemporary university, and as someone personally speaking who works in one, who teaches in one, you know, this idea of self-mockery and the kind of carnivalesque aspects of cynicism, right? I mean, don't we have to be slightly careful about that? Because I mean, in terms of self-mockery, right? I mean, you get into this situation where practical philosophy becomes the most virtuous and the most, you know, the most advanced type of thinking, you know, so you get things like, I suppose, Sloterdijk is the obvious example, right, of that kind of carnivalesque type of thinking, and his kind of carnivalesque reading of Diogenes is, you know, that Diogenes is just someone who is rejecting all forms of power. I mean, you get into areas of you know, irrationalism. You know, it becomes potentially, I think, in this climate, you know, the idea that it can be a model for thought. I mean, don't we have to be kind of quite careful about that? Because if, like, you know, if cynicism is about living like, you know, dogs, or, you know, I mean, isn't it kind of a bit close to living and thinking like pigs or something? Or, you know what I mean? That kind of carnival. We have to be slightly careful about the self-mockery, right, and how we apply it, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are different kinds of cynicism, right? There's the cynicism of the system itself, right? So you can internalize the idea that, oh God, I don't really believe it, but like everyone has to do this. You know, it's better that I like get a degree, that I get a job, that I do this and that. You know, because it's what we're supposed to do. Even if I don't believe it, I still must do it because that's what everyone else is doing, or something like this. And, you know, I mean, when I'm sort of talking about the students' fearfulness, it's not a criticism of the students as individuals, right? It's from a certain point of view, their sort of fear is rational. You know, they're correct to be worried about if they say or do the wrong thing, you know, because it could harm their standing or their future chances, right? Like, so they're not wrong, right, to be hesitant or to be fearful. And so there's no question of a sort of like moral disapproval of that kind of thing. It's like, you know, within the current situation, that does make sense as an option, right? So there's various kinds of cynicism. I think the kind of Rabelaisian sort of philosophy of the body and the sort of, you know, enjoyment of ritual and kind of excess and so on, you know, does have a place. However, I do think that one of the few kind of major cultural collective forms of mass thought provocation and generation are things like the mass illegal raves. I think the summers of love, you know, I always go on about this. I think we need a third summer of love to break people out of a certain kind of online techno bureaucratic isolated individualism. And, you know, I thought it'd be last summer, but of course everyone was locked in their homes, and maybe it'll be this summer. But, you know, something like this, you know, that is a kind of awareness of the fact of a sort of, a ritual enjoyment, collective being together in which, you know, individual sad passions are transformed into something joyful. And this also happens in protest and other things. And these are all things that are sort of increasingly being policed and cracked down and so on, right? And become much harder to do, although there have been various illegal raves and so on during this last year in particular. And of course, you know, what am I saying? I mean, I'm not saying this is a replacement for thoughts, or, you know, that we could in any way live in a permanent carnival. I mean, Walter Benjamin says in Capitalism as Religion that actually one of the horrors of capitalism is that we are in a permanent festival. You know, it's like we're in a fate with like a kind of a sort of a dream of a carnival without redemption. You know, that we're kind of in this permanent frenzy of like production and consumption, and there's something festival-like about it. In fact, even as we've gotten rid of rituals tied to natural changes and so on. And, you know, and so, I mean, I probably have a lot more sympathy for the Sloterdijk Rabelaisian position than I used to. I mean, partly because of like my own experience of nature and becoming fit after having been ill and being sort of trapped in the academy, you know, and sort of taking on those sorts of pathologies of hard work and, you know, I don't know, the neurotic, bureaucratic neuroses and that sort of thing, which I was never very good at and not very trained to do in many ways. And so, I suppose that there's that image of the outside as well. Like, you know, the outside is also where things can happen. I mean, it's a space of risk and encounter and, you know, and I think the safetyism of our world, the university, the fear, the lockdown, you know, is generating increasingly frightened subjects, who then become addicted to safety. And this is like, again, just extremely detrimental for thought, apart from anything else.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Any other questions? We've actually only been going for, we haven't even been going for an hour. It seems
I'm quite a succinct person. I don't believe in, wittering on for hours.
No, I'm not complaining. I'm just surprised. It seems like we've kind of been. Seems like we've been talking about so many different things. I wasn't aware that we've only been going for just an hour. Are there any other questions? No? Minsox, MJ? Anyone else? No one else online? Yeah, I'm
happy to end it, Jason. I mean, like, I think this idea that all podcasts and everything must be like hours and hours long is just.
No.
I mean, do you ever get to the end of a podcast? I don't know if I ever do.
Well, the funny thing is, there are some of these podcasts and streams where you kind of have, you spend about 20 minutes trawling through the introduction. You know what I mean? It's like you have something at the beginning, like a piece of music or something, and then someone comes on and does an introduction, and then someone else comes on, and so you kind of think, hang on a minute, this is only like 10 minutes. It's only 10 minutes of an actual debate. But I think that it's kind of that we're not in that at all. I mean, I came on, introduced you, and you went right into it. And
I think these sorts of lengthy media make sense in certain cultures, like a car-based culture. Like I know a lot of people listen to podcasts when they have to drive a long way and this kind of thing, or you're doing something else. But I mean, there's kind of like birdsong is more beautiful, right? Just going to the park is more beautiful than listening to two people sort of vaguely witter on for like 3 hours. No.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, no, the thing is as well, this is a little bit different because we probably won't edit this talk, so it's, in that sense, I also think it's slightly more engaging when you're kind of listening to people talking and, not really, there's no real script here, right? So we can keep talking or not keep talking, whatever. But any final questions then, and that way we can make it really succinct, right? We can make it like an hour. And I mean, people will be coming back to this. Let's not forget, right? This is going to be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and people will be coming back to it. So people are welcome to post comments. I can forward you comments and that type of thing. Was there anything else I wanted to ask, actually? I was writing down so many things. It was interesting what you said about historical materialism. That's kind of. I mean, were you slightly ad-libbing there? Because I wasn't. When we spoke before, and I didn't.
Yeah.
The historical materialism was an interesting point. I mean, we do need more historical materialism. Actually, I do agree with you. Although I'm an anti-historicist, I think I have a certain. A certain soft spot for historical materialism, and you do too.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the sense that it's not a historicism, right? I mean, I think to the historical materialism is simply to say like the transformation in matter and the organization of matter by human beings has a history, right? And this concerns the reality of production and consumption, amongst other things, and the modes of production and the way in which human beings labor, the relation this has to sex and family formation, and all of the things that Marx and Engels and Marxists have been writing about for a long time, and that there is a kind of method and an empiricism and a commitment to nature, I suppose. And I mean, maybe one of the things I'm increasingly worried about or thinking about is what's happening to nature, our conception of nature, in relation perhaps to the university discourse, or however we want to say it, and to this question of the outside. And a lot of the left have become sort of very technophilic and, just kind of almost Silicon Valley-esque in their kind of desire for a sort of left accelerationism and, as opposed to thinking about degrowth and other ideas. And I think one of the problems is, or one of the sort of reasons for this asymmetry, I suppose, in the thinking of nature is also already present in the work of Marx, and I'm very interested in, like, Schmidt's reading of the concept of nature in Marx, and because you can kind of take Marx in two directions in a way, and of course he's criticizing utopian socialists, and he there's no going back, as it were, to prelapsarian, primitivist idea of nature and all of those sorts of things. But at the same time, I mean, the total abandonment of any conception of human nature or our relation to nature in the broader sense, non-human nature, is just deranging. I mean, we're going to go mad if we do that, if we're not mad already. And I think there's something about the institutionalization of knowledge in the university that precludes even discussing nature in certain respects, so that you have the kind of scientific capture of nature, and here I agree with Husserl and Heidegger in a certain way, that the fundamental questions of science are foreclosed by the disciplinary division of it, and then a kind of almost like a omerta, or a sort of tacit understanding that there are certain things you can't discuss, in the liberal arts, which I think has been disastrous. And I think that's part of the thinking of the outside, is the thinking of nature, and it has to be this.
Yes, thinking of the outside again, yeah. So look, Nina, I mean, maybe that's a really good point to end. Thanks ever so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to reading the new book when it comes out, and keep well. And you're teaching at the Mary Ward Centre, right, in London?
Yeah.
For those people based in London who may be watching now, and maybe there'll be an opportunity for you to come and visit us in Korea at some point when that's possible, and maybe there'll be a translation. I guess there will be at some point of the new book, right?
Let's hope so. That would be cool.
Let's hope so. Yeah. Great. Look, thanks ever so much, Nina.
It's lovely to see you again, Jason.
Yeah,
it's always nice to see you.
Really nice to see you. Yeah, and let's keep this dialogue going. I mean, or this conversation rather. The next speaker in our series is going to be Esther Leslie. Not next week, but the week after. So 30th of April, I think I'm right in saying. Oh God, I hope I'm right about that. No, hang on. No, it will be the 7th, won't it? The 7th of May. I beg your pardon. So the 7th of May, we're going to be joined by Esther Leslie, who I know you're all familiar with, most of you, right?
Yeah, she's fantastic. She's great. She's
fantastic. So we're going to be welcoming Esther in a couple of weeks. So join us again. But for the moment, Nina, thanks ever so much, and see you next time.
Goodbye.
All the best. Bye.